All right, hey 1010 students. This week we're going to talk about funds of knowledge, but first I want to talk about something that many of you addressed last week, and actually there were 2 points. One was, I don't really believe the data that says the number of white students in America is going down as much as it is. So I'm going to talk about that. And then I'm going to talk about why certain people are more likely to go to college than others. A few of you commented on that, and I thought you brought up some good points, and I want to make sure that I address both those things. And then that actually leads really well into what we'll be studying this week with funds of knowledge. Okay, so first, when it comes to just the demographics, the evolving demographics in our country, Utah is actually pretty similar to the rest of the country in the trends that are happening. That African Americans are staying about the same. The number of white students by number and by percentage are going down, and that the number of Hispanics is going up dramatically. And then other racial minorities and multi race students are going up dramatically. So let's think about that for a minute. Number one, an explanation on why the total number of white students is going down is the birth rate is going down. And so we can't dismiss that. People are having less children than they used to have. And so that is going to have a reduction in the number of students because one generation might have less than the previous generation. So that's part of the reason. Now, another thing is that the demographics of our country truly is changing. When we consider the number of households that are multi-race, that has gone up dramatically in the last generation, where it's much more common to have blended families, mixed families. And part of that is through second marriages. So maybe someone will get divorced, get married again, have kids. Maybe my webcam will fall down. So so we have more mixed race families than we've ever had before, and that's contributing to the rise in certain races, but also the reduction of just white students. Now, as far as the second point, which is who's going to college and why is that? Some of you talked about this, and I really thought about this quite a bit. It has nothing to do with race, was the comment. It has nothing to do with race. It has all to do with how the values of the parents or how someone's being raised. And that is true, but it's not fully true because the values of humans are tied to their culture, and race is part of that. And so if you grew up, for example, in a family where college was expected, you're much more likely to go to college. That's just how it is. If you grew up in a culture where college was not expected, or maybe it was military service or something else, you're more likely to do those things. Now, that's not a hard, fast rule. You still might break that expectation or deviate from that expectation, but that's typically what happens. And so when we see that one religious group or political group or racial group is overrepresented or underrepresented in any particular area, often the explanation for that is what does that particular group value? And we're going to see an overrepresentation or an underrepresentation depending on what those values are. And so sometimes that works to our advantage, and sometimes not so much. And so you might have to overcome a cycle, or you might have to deviate from what's expected in your family. That does lead into the funds of knowledge for this week. And I want to talk about this. You haven't read the article yet, but the big idea here, the concept is that what we bring, our baggage that we bring because of our background, because of our culture, because of our heritage, what we bring to the school impacts how we view education and what we do. And I know that this is true because I read your papers on why we have education, and a lot of you came from very different perspectives and have different focuses of why we have schools in the first place. So we know that that's true. So the funds of knowledge is these funds or this background that we bring with us, and that impacts how we learn in the classroom or how we view the classroom. As a elementary school teacher, I saw this so obviously, and sometimes it was painfully obvious and I might have missed cues. But let me give one example. I had a student a few years ago who every day came in tired to class. He was just exhausted, and we would start the day with math, and he fell asleep in the middle of math like all the time. Now, he wasn't a bad student. He typically did quite well in school. He really struggled at the beginning of the day and he fell asleep. And after this happened multiple times, I mean, I got upset about it a few times. There were some consequences for falling asleep in class, and I talked to his parents, but didn't really get anything. So one day I pulled him out in the hallway and just talked to him, and I said, "Look, this has got to stop. You just can't sleep through math every time. It's distracting to the people around you. It's distracting to me as the teacher. Why are you so tired every day?" And he said, "Well, it's because a few weeks ago or a month or so ago, my grandma moved in with us, and we only have two bedrooms. And so I was already sharing a bedroom with my two brothers, but now it's my two brothers and me and my grandma. And my older brothers all have different schedules, and my grandma has a different schedule, and they go to bed really late, and it's hard for me to sleep." And he just explained that to me. Now, that's part of his background, and his it was tied to the culture and the fact that the extended family was part of the nucleus of the family. That's different from the way I was raised. My grandma never lived with me, and I didn't have to share a room with two other siblings. And so that impacted this student's ability to learn in the classroom. Now, I was able to work with that. Now, having this information, I was able to say, all right, well, I don't know what I can do about this, but let's try this. And I just gave him nap time. So during math, when he came in, I put him right to bed and made him actually an area of the classroom where he could fall asleep and he could do well. But that was with the expectation that later in the day, during lunch or afternoon recess, he would work with me to get caught up on math. Now, that's not a good long-term solution, but for a few weeks, it actually worked quite well. He got caught up, and then some things changed in the home, and we were able to work something out. But having that understanding of his background was really important to me as a teacher, those funds of knowledge. So one of the things you'll do this week is you'll consider your own funds of knowledge, and we're actually going to do an activity real quick. I have a document. I think I still have it. Let me find it. Nope, not that one. All right. In this document, I want to go through some of the things that are most common in funds of knowledge. So I'm just going to go through it with you. I might explain some of the things that make me unique, just because then you can get to know me better, and that can potentially improve what happens in this class. But I want you to consider the answers to these questions for yourself. So the first one, what's your home language? Now, we know from what we studied last week with the triple threat, if your home language is English, you're going to have an advantage in school. And that does have to do with race. That does have to do with culture. And you will have an advantage in school if you speak English. I've had a number of students over the years who didn't have English as their first language, and it was harder for them. They did have to work harder. They were less likely to go to college. And so that's an important thing to consider. In my home, we speak English, and that's all we speak. And so that perhaps gives me an advantage when it comes to the education system here in the United States. Family values and traditions. This is one that I thought a little bit about because I say no to doing homework and schoolwork on Sunday because of values and traditions. So that might be set me apart or make me different from some of my classmates growing up. Other values and traditions, in my family, education was highly valued. And so my parents looked for opportunities to get us into extracurriculars, to do things over the summer. We always had a lot of books in the house. And again, that gave me an advantage when it came to education and the traditional education system here in the United States. As a parent, I have seen this as well. As my income has gone up, I've been able to afford to give my children more opportunities for learning, to send them to science camp, to do different extracurriculars. Just this morning, we went to a tennis tournament with my daughter, and she participated in that tennis tournament because we could afford to send her to it. And so those things do matter, and they make a difference in the academic outcomes of our students. Caregiving. So I talked earlier about my student who lived with his grandma, but when we consider when you get done with your school day, or when your students get done with their school day, do they go home to their parents? Do they go home to a nanny? Are they latchkey kids that go home to nothing or nobody? And the television is their caregiver, or their mobile phones are their caregiver? That certainly makes a difference. I think I had an advantage again. Growing up, when I got home, my mom was there every day. And she was able to say, do your homework. And because I had someone tell me to do my homework, I was more likely to do my homework, which led to better grades, which led to me going to college. Not all kids have that same luxury in life. And somebody made the comment, well, their parents just don't care then. That's not necessarily true either. We all come from different circumstances, and sometimes it's really hard to overcome the challenges that we have in our life. A lot of parents, like myself, wish that I could do more for my kids. I wish that from the time they were very little, that we could afford to put them in music lessons, and that we could afford to have them travel the world and give them different opportunities that would enrich their lives. Now, we're still prioritizing those things, and we're looking for ways to make those happen. But just because we want something to happen doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to. The next thing is friends and family. We've kind of talked about that already, so we'll skip through that. Family outings. What does your family do for fun? I just mentioned traveling the world. This is something that we have prioritized in our home. In fact, part of the reason I'm teaching summer school this year is because I wanted to say yes to any extra opportunities to teach and to earn money, because we want to go on a big trip next year. My son's graduating from high school, and we want to go on a big trip as a whole family. And that's something that we value as a family. So I'm working really, really hard teaching an extra 7 classes this summer, and have another part-time job that I'm working so that we can do something next summer as a family. So that certainly impacts how my students see the world, or my children in this case, see the world, and makes a difference. Other family outings, we value going to science centers, to the STEM museums, or children museums around the country. We value going to zoos. We value going to museums. At least me and my wife do. Our kids, of course, like most kids, are like, no, not another museum. But they're learning things, and they know things that they might not otherwise do. Here's another cool example. When it comes to academic opportunities, another thing that's happening this summer, because I'm here teaching you, I'm not spending as much time with my kids, and my wife is in a similar boat. We thought, what can we do for our kids so they're still learning this summer, still doing productive things instead of watching television all day? And one of the things that we fortunately could afford to do is we got a subscription to Crunch Labs that Mark Rober does. He's the YouTube science guy. And our kids once a week get to do a science project together where they put things together. And it's really cool because without prompting, I've come home different days, and my 12-year-old son has said, Dad, we put this thing together today. Doesn't want to necessarily show me the thing or what it does, but he always says, let me tell you how it works, which is really, really cool for me. And so he's done that. Now, just a couple more here. Household chores. That's funds of knowledge. What's expected to do at home? Are you working? Are you emptying the garbages? Are you doing your own laundry? Are you preparing meals from time to time? Does that matter in the classroom? Absolutely. In my classroom, my students had classroom jobs. My students were expected to contribute to our community. With you guys as my students, sometimes I ask you to talk to each other in discussion groups. Actually, in this section, I don't think we do discussion groups. In some of my other classes, we do. You know what I'm saying. By doing certain things and having certain expectations at home, you make that adjustment better at school. Educational activities, kind of talked about that earlier. Favorite television shows. Does that matter in the classroom? Absolutely. I have seen with my students, even with behaviors, if they are more aggressive and violent, sometimes that's tied to the video games they play or the television shows they watch. Some of my students, I just mentioned Mark Rober. My students who watch Mark Rober and educational programs like that, they typically do better in class, at least in certain subject areas. And so that does make a difference. Family occupations. If your dad was a truck driver and your grandpa was a truck driver and your uncles are truck drivers, you're more likely to want to become a truck driver. And a truck driver doesn't necessarily require further education. But if your dad's a medical doctor and your uncle's a medical doctor and your grandpa was a medical doctor, there's more expectations or pressure placed upon you probably in your home to do well academically so that you'll have the opportunity to become a medical doctor if you want to. So household occupations do matter. And then scientific knowledge, I'm just going to skip through that. So those are some examples of funds of knowledge. And I hope that as I've gone through this with you, you've seen, oh yeah, my background matters. And because I've had these experiences and because there are certain expectations in my home, I'm more likely to do these things in the classroom. We need to remember that with our students. So the next step then is, how do we access those funds of knowledge? How do we learn about what our students value? And how do we perhaps influence that? So you're going to read about some suggestions in the reading on things you might do. It might involve having culture nights or doing home visits or phone calls or Zoom calls. One of the most rewarding things I ever did as a teacher and a K-12 teacher was I called home or emailed home to celebrate instead of to get someone in trouble. And so when somebody was showing progress, I let parents know about it. And that was such a rewarding thing. But through those conversations, sometimes I'd learn more about the students. Over COVID, when we couldn't meet together, I did home visits. I brought books to my students. I'd deliver them all around the county. And I would drive for hours, certain days of the week, to deliver books to my students. And some of the parents that I'd never met before, because they never came to parent-teacher conferences, I met them as I delivered books to their children. And so, and when you meet them and when you talk to them at their home, you learn more about their backgrounds and why the students act the way they do. So those can be really important things. As you go through the question I want you to think about is, what are the funds of knowledge that you have brought that impact your educational attainment? And what are the things that you should be watching out for your students? All right, that's enough of a lecture for today. Enjoy the nice, easy, short reading. Not a lot expected of you this week as far as funds of knowledge go. All right, bye.